Hello, I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about generic drugs, problem or solution. So as usual, I'll be talking for about 20 to 25 minutes. This video may well be longer than that because there will be question and answer at the end, and they may be on this topic or broader topic. And as usual, I will also start with the take-home message, so that should be done in about 1 or 2 minutes. If you have a short attention span, that'd be all you need. So the take-home message is that until about 1983 in the US, there were significant barriers to developing and marketing generic drugs. And at that time in 1984, only about slightly less than 20% of the drugs in the US that were being used and prescribed were generic drugs. Right now in 2024, the number is upwards of 90% of drugs are generic. And this represents a huge cost savings. So the economists who average it or take the numbers say that on average, the generic drug is about 7 to 8 times cheaper than the brand name drug. As I'll jump to in the presentation, when I looked at some ADHD and some other psych drugs, that was anywhere from 3 times cheaper for the generic to 33 times cheaper, exact same substance. So generics are supposed to be the exact same chemical substance, but significant variation is allowed in 2 measurements of how bioequivalence, or how well the drug is getting into the body. And the 2 measurements that the FDA looks at are the peak level, so how high it ever rises, and what's called the area under the curve, which is the curve is level in your blood versus time, level this way, time this way. So the area under the curve represents how much drug is getting into someone's body, how much is absorbed, essentially. And those are allowed to vary by being as low as 80% of what the brand name drug delivers and as high as 125%. So 4/5 to 5/4 of the standard. And that for certain drugs is potentially problematic, and it's most problematic for drugs where the exact dosage at a given moment or the timing of the delivery of the drug is crucial. And that happens to be in psychiatry area, the stimulant medications used for ADHD, and also among the other drugs most commonly having problems in the generic section or patient complaints are the benzodiazepines, the Valium, Xanax, Ativan-like drugs that how quickly they go in may well have an impact on their effect. On the other hand, antidepressants, antipsychotics are less affected. And in general, many people get very good identical results from their generics. So that's the take home, jumping into the talk itself. And I should provide the warning that this is going to be largely about US rules and regulations, because much of this field is determined by the laws that are on the books. So different countries have different standards and laws, which may be more sensible or less sensible than the US. So this is a US specific talk and might get more into the legal and economics than some people might be used to with my talks, but I'll launch into it. So again, 90% of the drugs right now in 2024, upwards of that number, are being dispensed as generics, and that's representing only 1/4 of the money spent on medications. So that's showing that, again, a few really expensive brand name drugs are taking up the lion's share of costs in this country. And I'm going to cite a couple different numbers for different drugs, the generic versus the brand name cost. Actually, I'll start with the brand name first. And these numbers are taken from GoodRx, which is a very good resource. You can put in your zip code, you can put in the drug you're taking, and it will tell you what different pharmacies in your area are charging it for it. So immediate release Adderall IR, 20 milligrams, number 60, that's a solid dose. The brand name for that is $660 on average, versus only $20 for that same dosing of the immediate release, 20 milligrams twice a day. That's a 33-fold difference. Interestingly, if you switch over to Adderall XR, 20 milligrams, and there the default for cover my meds is just 1 a day. Interestingly, the Adderall XR brand name is 220, so it's actually less expensive than brand name IR on a milligram basis. And the generic of the Adderall XR is only about $30. So that's at least a 7-fold difference there between the brand name and the generic. If we jump over to Vyvanse, which went generic in August of last year, 2023, so 40 milligrams of 30 pills. So all these are supposed to be 30 days dosing. So for Vyvanse, 40 milligrams brand name is close to 400. And one thing that's noticeable with the brand name drugs, there's much less variation to drugstore, chain to chain. But there's a lot of variance among which store you go to for the generic price. So Vyvanse is averaging about $120 in the generic version. So that's at least a 3.5-fold difference there. Mydayis, which just went generic 2 weeks ago, I believe, 50 milligram dose, number 30 of those, that sells for about $340 to $370, so a little more than $11 a pill in the brand name, and that's already only about a third of that, $100. Some stores are selling it for $250 for the generic version, but it's about a third of the cost if you go to generic. If we look at some non-stimulant drugs, Strattera, 40 milligrams, again, 1 pill a day, brand name is costing $425 to $478 different stores versus generic, which is $30 to $115. Again, there's more spread among the generics, but that's at least a 10-fold difference. And if we look to other psych drugs, something like Prozac that's been generic for well over a decade, brand name Prozac, 20 milligrams standard doses, $450 versus, which is more than $22 a pill versus $20 for a month's worth. So again, that's a 22-fold difference. So now with drug shortages still happening in the stimulant world, it might not matter as much what they say the price is, because if they don't have it, they don't have it. And I will detour into a joke. I don't usually tell it, but pertinent to this point, a guy walks into a butcher shop and he wants to buy some hamburger, and the butcher says it's $12.99 a pound. And the guy says, "Why is it so much? The shop around the corner sells it for only $4.99. The butcher says, "So why didn't you buy it there?" And he says, "Oh, well, they're all out of it." Well, then the butcher says, "Well, our price is $4.99 too when we don't have any of it." So again, prices may be one thing, availability is another, but jumping back into generics. So the FDA says that generics are the same, and they are staunchly promoting and have been for years, just because of the cost savings to our medical system. And they're the ones in charge of making sure that generics are as good quality as the rest of the medications. But their claim is generics are the same as brand name drugs in dosage form, safety, strength, route of administration, quality, performance characteristics, and intended use. So part of that is that generics get approved for the exciting use. I mean, doctors can still write for them off-label, but officially, if you're getting a designation as a generic, you have to be, you can only advertise it, you can only push it for the same intended use. Again, it can be written off-label and in the same pill strength. So if Prozac only came in, so for years it only came in at 20. So if the generic was approved at that time, the generic could only be 20. There are other doses of Prozac now. In route of administration, if it's an oral medication, you can't tell people the generic. I mean, you can tell them as a doctor, but the company can't get approval for the same drug used, open up the ointment or the capsule and smear it on your skin, unless they go through a new drug application rather than a generic drug application. So the FDA, though, does allow different fillers, and the fancy word for fillers is excipients. So different excipients, different fillers are used, and those are binders, colorants, flavors. Those can be different. It can actually be different salts. So the sodium, the chloride salt or the carbonate salt or the bromide salt are all acceptable alternatives or exchanges from the FDA's point of view for most drugs. And the pill shape is not only can be different, it's actually required by US trademark law to look different. So the generics can't look identical to the brand name drugs. And I think there's a big problem with that. I'll get to that at the end. So the big issue, though, in terms of the most common problems that generics run into is the bioequivalence determination. So the FDA only proposes in their official guidelines 2 markers or 2 measurements for determining whether a generic is bioequivalent to the brand name. And the only 2 quantities or qualities that they're looking at is the Cmax, so the peak of the drug at any point in time. So the peak, again, has to be at least 80% and no more than 125% of what the generic or what the brand name achieves. And the area under the curve, so how much total is absorbed into the body, again, has to be at least 80% and no more than 125%. That's a pretty big amount of slop, probably not that crucial for many drugs which have a broad therapeutic window. And investigators, both in the FDA and outside of it, say that most generic drugs actually fall much closer to being within 4% of what the brand name is providing. But if you are wanting to cut corners, there's ways legally you can cut corners and say your product is the same thing when it's delivering substantially is 81 or 82% of what the brand name is delivering. So the medications so we have certain classes of medications. So anti-seizure drugs, antiarrhythmic drugs, probably to the level certain antibiotics. Maintaining the blood level in a very narrow range is important for therapeutic efficacy. And the other variable, again, how quickly the drug is going into the blood is not at all one of the criteria that they're looking at. So I think many of the problems with generic stimulants, and I've often had people say, I did find on brand name Adderall XR, and then when I switched to the generic, what people often say is it's not doing anything. There's nothing in it that gave me a sugar pill. Now, legally, they can't have nothing in it. It has to have the same active ingredient. But we know with stimulants, what's important is not just the total amount or how much is hitting the receptor at that moment, but the change in the concentration at the receptor level. So if you have a very slow, gradual ramping up, that will be experienced substantially differently in the brain than a sudden surge into the receptor. So I think most of the problems we see with generics are that the timing of the release or timing of absorption and entering into the blood and then the brain is substantially different, even if these global parameters of where the peak is at the highest moment and how much total is absorbed. And again, it makes sense that although there are some complaints for any medication I've seen out there, but very seldom have I heard people complaining about their antidepressant or their antipsychotic. Now, those drugs, getting the right amount of drug in your blood over the course of several days is important in terms of having a benefit, but it's not a direct one-to-one relationship between blood level and efficacy. So these are drugs that have indirect effects. I've talked about this in some other videos here, whereas the drugs which are having immediate effects where benefits are tied into either the direct level at that time or the change in the level at that time are going to be sensitive. And in psychiatry, that tends to be the stimulants and the benzodiazepines, the anti-anxiety drugs, where how quickly they go in. If you're expecting your Valium to feel it within 2 to 5 minutes and it's not doing its thing, you don't feel it because it's going in more slowly, that itself can feed into creating anxiety. That this feels different, this feels weird, this feels like it's not going to help me. So that can undermine efficacy. So jumping more into what that 1984 law did. So the 1984 law is called the Hatch-Waxman Act, named after Orrin Hatch, a Republican senator from Oregon, and Henry Waxman, Democratic representative from California. They're both retired from active politics life, but they're both actually alive more than 40 years after they wrote this bipartisan legislation. And up until that time, a generic drug had to wait until the patent was completely expired on the brand name drug before they could even test whether their version was effective or useful. And they had to go through the exact same studies for the FDA. So they had to show efficacy, they had to show safety, they had to show that their drug really, really worked in real patients who had the condition. That's a lot of testing and a lot of work. Now, if it was something like an insulin product that you knew that there were still going to be millions of people out there, it would still might be in your interest to go through that testing and get approval for a generic drug. But that was a big barrier for lots of companies to overcome. So in 1984, they changed the rule. So the other one part of the rules or the laws is that the company that registers a drug gets 20 years of patent protection from the time they register the drug, and that gives them market protection to prevent other companies from coming in and selling the drug. So there's a little clarifications there. One is until actually 1995, so a decade after the original law. Up until 1995, that 20-year clock started with the filing of the patent. In 1995, it was reversed or set earlier. Or actually, I said that differently. Up until 1995, the clock started ticking when the patent office issued the patent. In 1995, they set it differently. So as soon as a company filed a patent claim, that's when the 20 years patent protection starts. And it highlights that there's two separate processes here. One, there's patent registration with the US Patent Office, and two, there is what's called a new drug application with the FDA. So usually a company files a patent and fairly shortly after that files a new drug application when they have enough clinical studies to show that the drug is likely to be effective to try to get the FDA's approval. So patent and NDA approval, new drug application approval, are separate processes. The second one is controlled by the FDA. So the Hatch-Waxman Act of 1984, changed the whole process for a generic drug. So rather than starting a new drug application, they were allowed to do what's called an abbreviated NDA, so an ANDA, and they only have to show bioequivalence to a brand name accepted drug. So again, they don't have to go through all that safety testing. They don't have to actually show that their product works in real people. They just have to show this is biologically equivalent to the brand name drug. So it does have to be the same chemical, but it can be linked to a different salt. It can have a different delivery system. We'll get to that. It can look different. It can have different additives in it. And there can be as much slop again as only 80% of the total amount to as much as 125% absorbed into the body or at the peak concentration. So the other piece of the Hatch-Waxman Act were they allowed the generic company to start running trials before the brand name drug's patent had expired. And that's designed because effectively, if you say you can't even study it because you're infringing on the patent of this first company until the 20 years are over, then you're giving the original company actually more than 20 years because it's going to take time for that company, the generic company, to start proving that they have a bioequivalent product. So part of the Hatch-Waxman Act was to give protection to the generic companies so they could start testing their generic and showing that it's bioequivalent without infringing on the patent rights of the brand name maker. Now, there are also some other, so a couple things. The process does take a fair number of years. So there's no company that has had 20 years of patent exclusivity or patent protection or marketing exclusivity because some of that time is eaten up by the paperwork process, application process. So in the Hatch-Waxman Act, there are a couple ways market extension or market exclusivity was added back in beyond potentially that 20 years from filing with the patent office. So One is what's called a 5-year extension, or I'd say it's more a restoration of those 20 years. So half of the time between the patent filing and the new drug application, so if it took you 10 years from filing the patent to actually filing your new drug application, you get up to 5 years of that back. Now, if you took 15 years, you don't get 7.5 years added on. If it took you 4 years, then you get half of that, 2 extra years. And time is also added back or restored into that 20 years for the time it takes the FDA to approve the new drug approval. So if the FDA, usually right now, I think most recently a statistic I saw was 13 months if it's going to approve a drug that's been applied. But that, a year is a lot with the potential blockbusting drug. So again, the half the time between patent and filing and all the time that the FDA takes can be added on as an extension, but that extension can never be more than 5 years. And there's some other ways it gets excluded or potentially reduced. There's also a couple other exclusions for the brand name maker, where they get market exclusivity. One is, and I've talked about this in Sunosi, so there's a video on that, what's called the orphan drug exclusion. The government wanted to promote making drugs available for rare conditions where it may not be cost effective for a company to spend years and years developing, manufacturing, or testing a certain drug before it can put it on the market. So they get an additional 7 years of market exclusivity, which means no other maker can jump in if it's approved for an orphan drug use. And that's protection is for the orphan drug indication. But again, the drug maker can look for other uses for their drugs. So Sunosi was approved for narcolepsy. That's an orphan drug condition. But right now they're very actively, they're about to apply for NDA, new drug application for using it for ADHD. They get 7 extra years beyond their patent. There's also a new indication exclusivity. So if you have a new use for your drug, again, separate from whether it's orphan drug or not, you can apply and get 3 years of market exclusivity where other companies cannot come in and market a generic drug for that same substance, for that same indication. And there's also a pediatric exclusivity. So if you get your drug approved for adults and then you do additional testing to show that it's also works in kids, then you get an additional 6 months. That doesn't help much in the ADHD world, where still almost all the drugs are studied and approved first for kids. So there's no additional pediatric exclusivity added on just because you started with kids. And then there's what's called the 180-day generic drug exclusivity. And this is an exclusivity that's not protecting the original brand name marker. It protects the very first generic drug maker that comes in. And this is designed, again, to incentivize makers who aren't quite sure that the market, that there's a viable market for them to get in. So the very first generic maker that jumps in and applies the ANDA, abbreviated new drug application form, gets exclusive essentially half a year before any second generic can come in. And there's situations where nobody filed for that. So with Vyvanse, it was approved recently in the end of August 2023. And within weeks or days, I think, of its entry, there were 14 different drug generics jumping in, trying to take up market share. But the 180-day exclusivity is part of why prices don't tend to come down right away. And there's certainly cases where manufacturers have hugely manipulated the process. So when Adderall XR came out, they know that many insurance companies immediately, so Adderall XR brand name was there for a while. When the first generic Adderall XR came out, the company knew that many insurance companies would force people immediately onto the generic version. And for about 6 months, the generic actually cost substantially more than the brand name. So that company was reaping big profits for a limited time until new additional generics could come on the market. So situations in which generics have been problematic. One of the best documented is the case of Wellbutrin XL. And this is, Wellbutrin is a drug that's effective in ADHD. I have a talk on that as well. So Wellbutrin XL, 300 milligram form, Teva Pharmaceuticals, biggest generic maker in the world, came out with something they called budepion. It was released in 2006, and there were complaints right away and strangely, people felt that they were having symptoms of both too much, so they were feeling too revved up and jittery, and yet substantial numbers of people who were taking it for depression had their depression recur or remit, which is actually really good evidence refuting the people who claim that antidepressants really don't do anything. Won't get into that one. Have a talk on that as well. So people were complaining right away. The FDA looked into it, and in 2000, and there were formal complaints issued. In 2009, they started evaluating it. In 2009, they said it was, FDA ruled it was bioequivalent, but by 2012, they ordered the Teva company to do its own bioequivalent study. So often the FDA is relying on drug manufacturers to monitor themselves or check themselves. And Teva dragged its feet and actually claimed they couldn't find enough patients to do the formal tests. So by 2014, the FDA had done some of its own bioequivalent tests and pulled generic Teva 300 milligram Wellbutrin XL from the market for more than a year. That's the first generic that was ever banned from the marketplace of any class of drugs. And the study showed that only rather than hitting 80% of the end of the curve, it was actually less than 75%. So people were getting lower doses, and the timing mechanism was, so Wellbutrin XL uses osmotic technology to pump drug out at a very steady rate. This was not using the same technology, and there was a big surge in the drug. So that's why people were feeling overstimulated, had side effects of too much, along with effects of not getting enough. There have been similar issues with generic, and I have a talk on generic, so I won't, Concerta, so I won't go into that in too much detail. But with generic, it's also an osmotic delivery system with Concerta, and of the generics that were approved, some used osmosis, some didn't, some even of the osmotic delivery systems weren't bioequivalent. The FDA dithered and dragged its feet after multiple complaints, and eventually did say these other forms aren't bioequivalent. The pharmacy can't just automatically substitute it when you're coming in asking for, or doctor's written for Concerta. So again, most of the problems that have shown up so far then with generics have to do with timing, but there's other potential areas for problems with generics. So one is the majority of generics right now are being made outside of the US. The FDA does inspect pharmaceutical plants in different countries, but and the two biggest producers are India and China. And there have been well-documented exposés of how inadequate the FDA's examination of some of these pharmaceutical plants are made, so that the FDA is often not granted access. Usually in the US, they're allowed to and do make surprise spot checks. In India and China, they've been blocked from spontaneously coming in and checking, which gives the company time to clean up or make a good impression. That doesn't mean everything coming from India and China is garbage. It just means that they're being scrutinized even by our own government less closely or less extensively. I think we should actually be moving to change the trademark laws that force them to have pills that look different from the generic, because particularly elderly people who are on a large number of medications, they more often identify their pills by the shape, by the color, by the size. Oh, I take the little blue one in the morning and the afternoon, and I take the round white one only at nighttime. And again, there's no currently regulation saying the drug has to be the same color, the same shape, the same size, the same anything. I think that's horribly confusing, particularly given what most pharmacies do is, so the government does not limit the number of generic companies that come in. The number is sort of determined by the market. With something like Vyvanse, which is the biggest selling stimulant for most of the last decade, 14 different companies jumped in because that was up to $1 billion business. For other low-selling medications, maybe only 1 or 2 generic makers jump in. So the pharmacies cut deals month to month with the different drug makers. So if you're getting generic, you're not, even if you're going to the same Walgreens or Rite Aid or CVS, you may get a different company manufacturing it each month. One thing to be aware of, it will somewhere on the label actually say who makes it. So if you have problems with a specific manufacturer, you can request your doctor to write, please do not fill with Ativan, or do not fill with Sandoz, or do not fill with Mallinckrodt, or whoever, Lupin, whoever has caused a problem. So again, I think the generic should be mandated to look pretty close to what the brand name is, just to avoid confusion among patients, and not just confusion, but sort of placebo and nocebo effects that, oh my God, this is a different color, it's going to not work as well. Some of the other issues is when there's only one brand name maker selling a product, their name is on the line. And again, even though you can trace or determine who made a generic, once there's multiple companies in the marketplace and it's written in much smaller writing and harder to find, they know fewer people are going to scrutinize or associate their name. And again, with the generic makers, they're not advertising or selling based on their name. They're just selling a product, whereas the brand name drugs, they're selling their brand. So there is less on the line, and it may encourage less good quality control on the part of the manufacturers. So the other topic, which is widely sort of under-researched, is those additives, those excipients. And so the two potential problems are there are tiny number of cases where someone had genuine immunological and allergic reaction to a filler content of their medication. And then there's potentially a more common problem of intolerance, where even though it's fairly small amounts, there might be lactose. Half the drugs out there have lactose, almost about 20% have gluten. If you are among those who are really insensitive, so lots of people have lactose intolerances, but usually they can take several grams worth of lactose before they have a reaction. But those who are at the sensitive end may be responding to that. So among the research that's been done, a couple facts jump out. On average drug has somewhere around 8, 9, 10 different inactive ingredients, excipients. Some drugs have as many as 20. I think the fewest any had was 4. So a broad range in the number of additives. On average, your pill is 75% excipients and only a quarter active drug. So that's a lot of room for exposure to chemicals that you might not need for beneficial effect. For elderly people where it's not, or people with a chronic illness where they might be on 10 different medications, then you're getting probably up to 3 milligrams a day of excipients in your diet. And there are actually more than 1/3 different inactive ingredients that have been used, or at least specifically proposed to be used as excipients or fillers. So bonding agents, preservatives, colorants, flavors. Not a tiny fraction of those have been tested for safety. Now, most of the drugs, most of the excipients, and most of the drug companies don't want to be killing their clientele. They want to keep them alive. They're not actively trying to poison people. And most commonly, so it's a very skewed distribution. Again, lactose is in a lot of drugs, gluten's in almost 1/5 of drugs. So very few drugs have many of these very rarely used inactive products, and most of the products are used over and over again because they appear to be safe. But they may be causing intolerances or problems in some unknown fraction of the population. So that's about all I have to say with generics, that they are, for many people, a huge cost saving. For many people, they are good alternatives, but particularly among the stimulants, it's not surprising that some people do have problems or issues with specific generics. So I will turn it over